Hi, my name is Andrea Lauritsen. I'm a mental health therapist working currently in Layton. I have worked as a school counselor for 3 years, and I know what it's like to be a teacher because my mom was a first grade teacher for 18 years and she loved it. But I know it was a lot of hard work and a lot of outside of class time and energy. So I appreciate what you do. I do know that there's a lot going on in schools right now, and that teachers can use all the support they can get. So I hope that my presentation is beneficial and in helping to give you information and resources to use in your classrooms. Today I'm going to cover how our society is faced with increasing numbers of students with trauma and chronic stress and what these are. This will include teacher training, or lack of, and how trauma-informed education is needed more and more. We'll also look at the impact of trauma on learning, socialization, and future success for individuals. Next, we'll look at what trauma looks like in an educational setting, so it can be recognized as trauma and not simply as bad behavior. I'll talk about what adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are, and how these affect brain development and therefore functioning. Then we'll briefly cover intergenerational trauma's impact on family systems related to educational support and attendance, and how chronic stress leads to challenges. Next, I'll talk about the value of resilience factors in increasing educational and life success and buffering against the ACEs one may experience. We'll look at how teachers can implement activities in the classroom setting to help heal a trauma brain, build resilience through adding skills, and provide a caring adult in the life of youth. Last, I'll talk about supporting teachers in and out of classrooms so that burnout is lessened and teachers can continue to be effective in the classroom, which is so important. The world is becoming increasingly chaotic, with higher rates of divorce, abuse, and community violence. All of this impacts our youth and their families. This, in turn, increases the numbers of students with trauma in a classroom, giving rise to higher behavioral and emotional issues in class and on the playground as children act out their stressors. Teachers get little to no training or support to understand how to support such children. However, this is changing as many schools are striving to become trauma-informed schools. Being able to understand what causes the educational barriers for youth and how traumatized youth might act out can greatly enhance a teacher's ability to offer the appropriate types of support to youth in their circles of influence. What would having the right kind of training and support for teachers mean to individual student learning and to classroom management for teachers? Think about that for a minute. This could be an excellent question to bring up for discussion during trainings or summer preparation to help individual teachers and schools determine where their strengths and weaknesses are and what gaps in training and support you have in your specific schools and classrooms. In this way, schools can look at increasing support and training over time for teachers and thus improve learning environments for the students, which is our goal. As I said, I worked as a school counselor for 3 years. I saw the impact traumatized students have not only on their own learning prospects, but even that of other students, as well as the teacher's ability to teach. Often teachers had multiple individuals in their classrooms struggling with emotional, behavioral, and family obstacles that interfered with their ability to focus and learn. Because teachers were trying to manage an entire classroom, they often became burned out attempting to teach with constant interruption, extra work related to increasing numbers of challenging students in their classrooms, and even complete shutdown of the class and the learning environment. For example, students in several classes that I worked in were so compromised emotionally or biologically that they required constant monitoring, extra staff support, which wasn't always available, and even watch care to prevent self-harm. One child tried to strangle himself in class one day by using the strings on the blinds, which was really traumatic for the teacher and all of the students to watch a child in their class try to kill himself. And there was a lot of distress. And so I went in and was able to present as an intervention, just talk about mental health and talk about how the reason that students have some of these feelings and why they would do that, how it's not something that we ever pretend or use as a way to get attention. And I think that was really helpful to the students in the class because it gave them an opportunity to to talk about how they felt about what happened with this student in their class. But I know that there were other situations in the school where students would overturn the desks, or their behavior was escalated to the point that they were yelling or running around or engaging in behavior that pretty much shut down classroom learning for everyone. And I know that because of laws and things, teachers can only do so much in situations like that where a student can get out of control. So being able to know what kinds of things could be helpful to de-escalate or prevent escalations, I think, is really a valuable tool for teachers to have. In many of these situations, because they couldn't remove the student, they had to then move all the rest of the students from the class. So we were able to, after a couple of incidents, help teachers to have lesson plans prepared for situations like that, where they might need to remove the class from the classroom learning environment and take them into the hall or somewhere else to continue being educated. Even though the behavior often is addressed through suspensions or other school regulations, the trauma behind those behaviors often is missed or misunderstood. There's always a reason for a behavior. If we can take the time to address the reason, often the behavior can then be minimized or eliminated. But this takes time, and if it's caught early, then we can change a child's life. And so that's one of the reasons I love working with young children and even teens, because I believe in early intervention. I believe that being able to help children learn skills or help them heal from trauma early rather than later is going to be more beneficial to their long-term outcomes. We know that the world is not going to get better and that the lives of our youth will be increasingly difficult. How can schools and classrooms then prepare for these inevitable trauma behaviors and stressful incidents so that students and teachers can feel safe even during those scary situations and situations where people don't know what's going on or what might happen? It's my hope that teachers and administrators will take this question seriously and put in place a plan that addresses the trauma behind the behavior, the expanding effect of challenging behaviors in the classroom, and the global impact on teachers and the school at large. Have a safety plan in place and practice it occasionally. This is your emotional fire drill for classroom safety. Many of you may not have any idea of the types of situations children face that may lead to trauma. Probably you have a pretty good idea, some of them because you're dealing with them on a regular basis and how it affects your classroom and the learning of the students. So here is a short video explaining a little bit about ACEs and about how these types of things can impact youth in the classroom and in their life.
Early childhood experiences, both good and bad, have a large impact on our lifelong health. They even affect how our brains develop. Positive stress, like meeting a new caregiver, is a healthy part of early childhood. But negative or adverse childhood experiences, like abuse, neglect, or parental substance abuse, can create toxic stress. And toxic stress, built up over time, has been linked to poor health conditions later in life, like obesity and heart disease. But there are steps we can take to reduce the impact on our children's health. Building strong, safe, stable, and nurturing relationships and environments, both at home and in our community, can help prevent adverse childhood experiences and encourage the healthy development of our children. Ensuring children have a supportive adult they can count on also combats toxic stress, builds stronger brains, and sets children up to be successful members of our society. This adult doesn't have to be a parent. Any family or community member can help. By working together, we can help children thrive and build resilience to life's challenges.
I hope that you found that video enlightening and that you garnered a little bit of information from it. In a study done in the 1990s, it was discovered that our early childhood experiences, which would be up to the age of 18, greatly impact our lifelong outcomes related to health, relationships, education, and career outcomes. Early experiences do affect how our brains are wired. They change our response to stress, causing us to experience stress more often and more intensely. Because of these and other changes, our ability to learn is impacted. It changes how we develop over time, unless interventions happen to alleviate the negative impacts. The results found not only these outcomes, but that your ACE score, which I'll talk a little bit about here, the higher the ACE score is, the greater the likelihood that you would have these negative health impacts 20, 30, 40 years down the road. But we have gained so much more information with the ability to scan the brain and to see how stress and experience changes our brain, that now we know a lot more about how trauma does impact our brains and what that might then lead to later on. We now know that the brains of someone who has experienced trauma is much different than that of someone who has not experienced trauma. So this slide here shows the brain of a normal 3-year-old, someone who has not experienced trauma, and the brain of a 3-year-old child who has experienced severe neglect, which we know through studies can lead to the greatest long-term impacts. So how do you think this smaller, less developed brain then will impact a child's ability to learn and function normally? Trauma also shrinks the hippocampus, which influences one's ability to process emotions and manage stress. So this next slide shows how trauma also changes the amygdala, which is our fear processing center, the prefrontal cortex, which deals with decision-making and self-regulation, and the sensory association cortices and cerebellum, which process and regulate emotions and moods. Thus, one who has suffered a lot of trauma will struggle with regulating emotions and moods and making decisions effectively or wisely. These challenges can lead to dysregulation in the classroom, emotional outbursts or meltdowns, withdrawal under pressure or when the youth are afraid, or challenges with anything related to decision making, such as rules, peer associations, homework, and classroom interactions. So you can see that this trauma then can have a great impact not only on their learning, but their ability to function effectively in a classroom environment, on the playground, and elsewhere. These children and youth may have skewed perceptions of the world because of what's happened to them. They may have little trust in adults or authority. They are likely to suffer a myriad of issues that influence how they see, relate to, and perceive the world and their place in it. All of this affects their ability to learn and interact in healthy ways. We've talked a lot about the students' experiences and how these influence their learning and the classroom experience. But how does a teacher's childhood and life experience change their ability to teach and interact with their students? Let's take a few minutes to complete the ACEs survey and the resilience questionnaire, which we will be using later in the presentation. When you're ready, go ahead and push pause to complete the handouts and then push play again when you're ready to continue the presentation. I want you to be able to fill out these surveys and questionnaires so that it helps you kind of know where your standing is as we move forward in the presentation, because I think that can be really beneficial. Take a moment now to know what your ACE scores were. Think about how this might be impacting your life today, especially in the classroom, and especially if your ACE score was 4 or higher, which is considered significant. And think about how your students' ACE scores might be influencing their ability to learn and their future prospects. As you can see on this slide, the 1990 study found that 64% of people had at least one adverse childhood experience. That kind of comes with life, right? We can have hard things that happen to us. We can have challenges. 40% experienced 2 or more ACEs, and only 12.5% had an ACE score of 4 or higher, which would be 4 out of 10. Yet that was nearly 30 years ago. It's likely that these numbers, if this study were done today, would be significantly higher than they were 30 years ago. Think of that, and it's likely then that teachers will have at least one student with an ACE score of 4 or higher, but probably up to 5 at the same time. And how does this affect learning in the classroom when you've got 5 of these little trauma kids or teenagers in your classroom acting out because of what they've been through because they haven't learned healthy responses. When we experience early trauma, especially a lot of it, our fight, flight, freeze response might get stuck in the on position. So this response has been passed down since the dawn of ages, when people had to respond quickly to life or death situations, such as, if you're being chased by a bear. Today, though, we often have our fight, flight, or freeze get flipped on when it's not a life or death situation, such as, oh, I've got a test coming, and people go into panic mode. It's the end of the world. If I don't pass this test, I'm going to fail. And that switch gets turned on, which puts them in fight, flight, or freeze. So they're either going to run away from the situation, or their brains are going to shut down and they're going to freeze up and they won't be able to remember what they have studied for the test and what they know, or they might become very aggressive and go into fight mode. So you may see kids, especially, I know you all just recently did end of year testing. So you may have had kids that went into this fight, flight, or freeze that, got very aggressive. I don't want to take the test. It's really stupid or it's scary. Or kids that completely shut down and didn't do it. Or kids that went into panic mode. And so being able to know how to help those kids flip off that fight, flight, or freeze so that their brains can re-engage in the decision-making part and the reasoning part of their brain, it'll help them do well on the test, can be engaged. What happens when there's early trauma is that switch can get flipped to on, but it doesn't always get flipped off, often because the trauma is ongoing or the stress is continuous, and so they're always on fight, flight, or freeze. And this can really impact their ability to function. These children who have had a lot of this trauma, chronic stress, even though they're not under current trauma in your classroom per se, they might feel like they're constantly in a life or death situation, even when those situations are no longer happening or when they're not currently happening in the classroom. But that's how their bodies feel because of this fight, flight, or freeze. So in a classroom, children who have this response switched on might respond in an extreme way to a situation as though their life depended on it, or as if their life was being threatened, and even when it's not necessarily happening. So you might see this in kids that are made fun of and respond with such extreme violence that they put another kid in the hospital. You might see kids having complete meltdowns because they failed the test or couldn't complete a required assignment in the allotted amount of time. These might be kids whose fight, flight, or freeze is kicked on and who are responding as if their life is in danger because that's what it really feels like to them. Because their brain is switched on all the time, these stress chemicals are flooding the cells of their body all the time, causing damage over time in learning, relationships, and future success. So we want to be able to help them learn to kick that switch back to off when it's not a life or death situation. So let's review all the impacts trauma has on the brain over time. So decreased emotional and mood regulation leading to meltdowns, suicidal ideation, self-harm, and other things. Decreased self-regulation leading to behavioral challenges or problems, delinquency, violence, or vandalism. Decreased decision-making ability affecting all areas of their life, social, educational, learning. Decreased ability to focus effectively due to hypervigilance, stress responses, and more. And I'll talk a little bit about what those are later. Decreased ability to learn and retain information, leading to poor school performance and possibly dropping out or other outcomes. Decreased ability to learn and maintain healthy social interactions. Increased hypervigilance, increased negative health impacts over time, possibly manifesting as multiple sick days, mental health issues, and chronic illness for some of these kids. Imagine trying to learn with all this going on in your life. It might feel overwhelming and insurmountable for many of our youth. They could benefit from extra support and understanding as early as possible so that they can flip that switch off and teach their brains how to function more effectively. Many of you have likely not heard of such a thing as intergenerational trauma. All of the experiences we have are stored in the tissues of our bodies. These experiences can then be passed down through our DNA like hair color, diabetes, or alcoholism. The storing of our memories in our cells is called cell memory. In books such as Childhood Disrupted and The Body Keeps the Score, we learn that even things that we may not consciously remember are still remembered in the cells of our bodies. Our bodies remember them and react to those memories. So when these trauma memories get passed on to the next generation, children start at a disadvantage. We'll talk a little bit about that, what that might look like. Imagine that your family has been a family of drug addicts for generations. This lifestyle is highly chaotic and often leads to neglect, sexual abuse, homelessness, inconsistent caregiving, and more. So they've got a lot going on, these little kids. So this leads to high amounts of trauma early in life, obviously. We know that trauma can shrink the hippocampus, because we talked about that earlier, affecting self-regulation and decision-making, which are very important in lifestyle choices and education. So your grandparents had a smaller brain capacity to make good decisions and to withstand addictive tendencies, which led to your parents' trauma in their childhood. They might have received in their DNA a smaller hippocampus, making it harder for them to self-manage, leading to a continued lifestyle of increased chaos and stress. So that all got passed down because they had less capacity to make different decisions than what the generation before them had made. And then they passed all of that on to you. So each generation, maybe there was a less developed brain capacity to self-regulate, to make good decisions, to manage your emotions, and then add on top of that the next generation of trauma, which is going to impact that stress response and impact your learning abilities, which then makes a deficit in your opportunities. So it all compounds over time. And you can see how this type of generational trauma continues from one generation to the next, but also how it biologically puts each generation at a greater disadvantage to make good life choices, leading to more trauma for the next generation, which is pretty sad. What does all this mean for educational settings? Did you know that the symptoms for trauma and for ADHD are the same? So imagine you have two kids in your classroom. They're both acting kind of similarly, hard to focus, moving from one thing to the other, antsy, all those things that you see and you would label as ADHD. But how do you know then if the child has ADHD or if they have trauma history? Well, they could be experiencing both, granted, because it could be part of their DNA to have and develop ADHD, but the trauma is going to compound that. So one thing that you could do is administer the ACEs survey and just see what kind of trauma, if any, this child might have experienced, or have the parents fill out the survey for the child and see if there's a trauma history. If there's a trauma history, then you want to look at, okay, how can we get them support through professionals to address the trauma? And you have your assessments for ADHD and could also administer that. And you could ask the parents if ADHD is something that runs in their family. Because we know that mental illnesses often are passed down as well. If they're in the family, you're more likely to get them than if they're not in the family. If you administer medication to a child that you assume has ADHD and the medication isn't working, it's likely that they don't have the ADHD, they have trauma. So that's another way to kind of assess. And it's often that these kids with trauma are diagnosed as ADHD because, like I said, the symptoms are the same. It's important to determine if their behavior is based on biology, ADHD, or trauma, which also affects their biology, but in a different way, and be able to get them the best support for whatever's going on with them. Kids might experience hypervigilance, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. which just means that they are super aware of everything around them. They're going to notice the ticking of the clock that nobody else can hear, chalk on the chalkboard, people tapping their feet. This not only makes it hard to focus on what they should be focusing on, but it's also exhausting because it takes so much energy to be that hyper aware all the time. Our brains aren't meant to do that. Our brains take in a lot of information, but filter out majority of it. But with hypervigilance, they're not filtering it out effectively, and so it's really interfering with their ability to focus on the educational things that they're supposed to be focusing on. Often there is so much going on inside or in the home for these kids that they find it difficult to focus on homework or class. When you're hungry or afraid or don't know what to expect when you go home each day, it's hard to care about math or English or history. Their concerns can be overwhelming and leave no room left for learning, and that can be really hard. Not that they don't want to learn, but they're just that they don't have that space in their environment, in their system to be able to manage that effectively. You might have kids in your classroom that are easily stimulated or feel overstimulated all the time. They might be light or sound sensitive, or they don't like to be touched. They might feel uncomfortable or even threatened in crowds, or even being close to others. So standing in line might set them off because of that closeness. They may need headphones or areas with less visual stimulus to help them study and learn. They might need to have their own space, which might be larger than what other kids need to feel safe enough to be able to focus on learning and not who's next to them and what they're doing. Maybe they need to be at the beginning or end of the line so that they aren't feeling suffocated, or so that they feel like if something were to happen that they have an escape route, where if they're in the middle of the line somewhere, that might be disconcerting to them because they feel like there's no way out. And that could be distressing to them, and that might lead to aggressive behaviors of, pushing or doing something in the line that disrupts the line. So if you know that, that's hard for them, being able to create a safe place for them is going to make a huge difference for them to not feel that stress and to be able to feel more at ease and learn more effectively. There are lots of ways that we can help these kids manage what's going on in their body because of the trauma they've experienced. That will increase their sense of safety, their ability to focus, and their enjoyment of learning. Because if we're not stressed and we can learn what we need to, it's going to be more enjoyable. Some students might have a recent or prolific trauma that leads to post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome, PTSD or PTSS. Perhaps they've witnessed domestic violence or suffered abuse or endured a brutal parental divorce. And this PTSD responses often will begin with a trigger. This can be a person, place, smell, movement, or situation that reminds the student in some way of their trauma experience. For example, I worked at the Center for Grieving Children, and the owner has really, really long hair. And she said one day she was talking to this youth, I think it was a teenager, and she just put her hand back to flip her hair, and this kid just kind of shrunk up, like she was afraid someone was going to hit her. That would be a trigger. So that movement of moving the hand back, even though it was an innocent, non-threatening movement, was a trigger for the girl because it was similar to the person who was moving their hand back that was then going to hit her. So that's just kind of an example of what a trigger might look like. Youth might be triggered by a scent of a perfume or the smell or taste of a specific food, a situation on the playground that under normal conditions would likely not lead to any response at all. However, a trigger will likely lead to extreme reactions such as meltdowns, violence, aggressions, or withdrawals. So they'll go one way or the other, the fight or flight. When this happens, it's important to give the person some space and often some extra support and understanding. Being able to help them calm down, get back out of that emotional brain and into their reasoning brain is going to help them be able to make good choices about how they respond to that trigger, and being able to become self-aware of, oh, that's something that affects me. So now that I'm aware, then maybe I need to have a plan of how to interact when that happens again. And I know that teachers, it's important for you to be a safe person that they can talk to or feel comfortable with, or if you know that there's someone else that they feel comfortable with, make sure that you get them to a safe spot where they can calm down until they feel ready to come back and be with people, and then get them some professional help if you can. In teens, you might see more responses that look like rebellion, poor peer associations, addictions, violence towards other people and towards people and property, self-harm, suicidal ideation, those kinds of things. More than likely, these problem students are doing the best they can to work through or avoid their trauma. Excuse me. They might be self-medicating or attempting to escape the darkness of their lives for a while. There's always a reason behind the behavior if we'll take the time to find it. And that's really important. And I know teachers don't have a lot of time, extra time to be doing that kind of thing, but it could make a huge difference if you can take the time once to figure out how to help them so that it prevents problems later on. And you may need some support and some professional help to be able to do that as well. For those trauma family systems, so we talked about the intergenerational trauma, so those family systems that have a lot of chaos or have really difficult or challenging lifestyles going on, you're likely to see any number of the following responses. Parents may appear to have a lack of commitment or care for their child or their child's education. This might be due to their own sense of overwhelm or lifestyle choices that lessen their ability to function as effective parents and caregivers. Repeated tardiness and multiple absences because parents are unable to get them to school or because of increased health impact for the parent or the child or other members of the family. Children and youth might be often hungry or tired because they might lack resources at the home, or there might be a lot of chaos going on late into the night, or things that they're stressed about that makes it hard for them to sleep. And so you might see a lot of that going on. Their home life might just simply be really exhausting in and of themselves, making it hard for them to have the energy when they come to school to engage in learning activities. These kinds of trauma takes a toll physically, emotionally, and mentally, so that really they have nothing left when they come to school to focus on that or to engage in learning activities or appropriate social interactions and those kinds of things. Kids might exhibit poor hygiene or grooming. Perhaps no one has shown them how to properly care for their bodies. Maybe they don't have the resources. Maybe they're too tired to care. There could be a lot of things going on with that. You might get parents who are completely disconnected from their child's educational pursuits, or on the other side, you might have parents who exhibit extreme responses to their child's poor learning outcomes, inappropriate classroom or school behavior, or their child's life choices, such as skipping school, promiscuity, or their mental health issues even. These parents might blame the child, the teacher, or the school. These kind of parents are usually angry. Nothing's ever their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. And that's often a product of their own trauma or life experiences that they don't have haven't learned the skills to manage those situations more in healthy ways. I think it's important to understand that when children or youth are behaving in these ways, it's important to understand what's really going on with these kids and with their families, because I think understanding can make a huge difference in our own response. These kids, even their families, are probably completely overwhelmed, feeling exhausted or stressed due to their own and their family's current or historical trauma and chronic stress lifestyles. They're probably short of family and community resources and support to manage physical, emotional, and mental needs. So they not only have deficits in their own biology and resources, but they may lack other resources that we take for granted. They're probably suffering from those biological deficits we discussed earlier, which makes it harder for them to make good choices, to manage their emotions, to self-regulate, and to get out of that fight, flight, freeze so that they can function effectively. We've talked a lot about trauma. What is the difference between trauma and chronic stress? In the book, Childhood Disrupted, Nakamura talks about how chronic stress is considered stress that kind of goes on over a long period of time. She also noted in the book, which I found was interesting, that I have misplaced my book somewhere and couldn't find the quote, and I apologize. But she talks about how our current school experience for many of these children would be considered chronic stress. And the way that you can tell the difference is their children are more stressed during the school year than when they are not in school. The trauma from the ACEs study focused on 10 specific things that might occur once or over a childhood. Chronic stress is found when people have a lot of things going on at once for long periods of time. I talk to my clients a lot about stress versus resources. So we all have stress. That just kind of comes with the body, part of life. And a certain amount of stress can be healthy, as mentioned earlier in the video. This is called eustress or good stress. There is also distress or bad stress. This usually happens when our stress levels exceed our resources to manage them. When this happens, we need to lower our stress or increase our resources until the stress is then manageable. We want the stress level to be less than our resources to manage the stress that we're dealing with. And there's a lot of ways that we can do that. When looking at stresses and resources, it's also important to pay attention to what's going into your bucket, what gives you energy, enjoyment, renewal, and what's leaking out of your bucket, or the bucket of each of your students and their families. Knowing this will help you be more effective as teachers in teaching your students in the classroom based on where they are personally and in their families, and what that means to them in their ability to learn and engage in the learning experience. Helping students and yourself recognize where your stress comes from and having the skills to manage it in healthy ways is vital to lowering stress levels. I've included 3 handouts on stress that can be used in a lesson plan. Symptoms of stress, stress management tips, and recognizing stress. And you can look those over at your leisure. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to go over them now, but there's a lot of ways that implementing a lesson on stress and helping students, especially teens who are old enough to kind of understand that a little bit better, helping them recognize what's going on in their own life and how that's affecting them can be really empowering, because when we're aware, then we can choose to change it, or we can choose to stay the same. So along with this are protective factors, which I'll talk about in a minute, that can lead to resilience. And this handout, which I've also included, about what protective factors are and the various areas of life in which they can be found. And that can be included along with the stress, so that then you can talk about stress versus resources and where the gaps and what you can do to fill in those gaps. When I worked at Weber State, I worked with student athletes, and I had a student once that I had worked with for probably 4 or 5 years at that time, so I knew him quite well. He was one of the more challenged students, first generation college student, and I didn't know a lot about his family history, even though I had known him for a while. But one summer, he just disappeared for about a month. His friends didn't know where he was. He didn't answer his phone or email or the door. We didn't know if he was dead or alive. We were very concerned after this long time of him being gone and having no contact with him. So he resurfaced one day, and we were talking one day, and he said when he was young, his parents were into drugs, and when they would have their drug parties, all the kids would go into the bedroom and close the door, because that's what kept them safe. So something had happened, or a lot of things had happened that summer, and he just literally went into his room and closed the door, because that was what he had learned. That was his learned behavior, his learned response that worked for him as a youth, because it kept him safe during these drug parties. And I said to him, I said, that worked for you as a child. That kept you safe. But you have to decide now if that's going to work for you as an adult. If you're in a relationship or at a job and you just disappear for a month, they might not be there when you come back. And his response was, oh, I never thought of that. And I thought that that was really insightful for me because we're going to keep doing what we've learned to do. It's our automatic responses that we learned as children, that we've learned through life experiences, until someone or something shows us that there's a different way to do it, and maybe a healthier or a more effective way. And then once we're aware that there are other options, then we can decide, do I want to keep doing this thing that I've always done that may or may not work for me, or do I want to do something different that might give me a different result, which I might like better? And I think that that's a really valuable thing to help your students be able to understand that we do what we've automatically learned to do, but we don't have to keep doing it if it's not working for us. So hopefully you filled out the resilience questionnaire and you already have your scores. If not, go ahead and pause the recording now and fill it out because you'll want to know those scores. Katie Caterpillar Becomes a Butterfly is a narrative about trauma and doing hard things, and overcoming and healing from the bad things that happen to us in our life, for which we often have no control. This story can be used in your classrooms as a narrative to start a discussion about how we overcome hard things and what it's like to heal from the challenging things that we go through. There's a discussion page at the end of this book that provides other discussion and lesson objectives, questions that you might use, topics that you might address from the story narrative. So I'm going to switch to the story. I'm using a previously recorded version of the story being read. This is available on YouTube, so you could play it for your class instead of reading the story, or you could have students read the story individually.
Today's story is Katie the Caterpillar. Once upon a time, a family of silky green caterpillars lived in a tree next to a house. They were all hungry and searched for food. Caterpillars eat leaves and grass. One little caterpillar, Katie, was really hungry. She nibbled on juicy green leaves and tall stalks of grass. One day, as she was eating in her tree home, a big wind blew through the trees. The branches smashed together. Katie clung to her leaf with all her might. She was scared. She couldn't see the rest of her family anywhere. She didn't know what was happening. The wind was so loud. The wind ripped her branch from the tree and sent her flying through the air. The frightened caterpillar hung on tightly. She was tossed around, blown against fences, and scraped across rooftops. Then she lost hold of her leaf and fell to the hard ground below. It was a big fall, and Katie was bruised all over. The place she landed was strange and new. Katie didn't know what to do. As she lay on the cold cement, she heard a scary noise overhead. Caw! Caw! What was that? Thought Katie. Again, caw! Caw! The sound seemed closer, and everything got dark. Katie looked up and saw the shadow was from a large black bird. Frightened and not wanting to be eaten, the caterpillar crawled as fast as she could to a crack in the cement. The shadow got bigger and bigger. Katie moved slowly because she hurt so much. She kept her eyes on the crack ahead. Almost there, she said to herself. Caw! Caw! The bird's cry was so loud she could feel it. Everything was dark now. Snap! The bird's beak scraped the cement as the little caterpillar sank safely into the hole. Tired and hurting from the storm, the fall, and the race to the hole in the cement, Katie curled into a ball and went to sleep. The next morning, when Katie the caterpillar woke, she heard all over. Staying still, she listened for sounds of winds and birds. She stayed quiet and still for a long time. When the sun was high in the sky, the little caterpillar peeked out of her crack to look for a safe place to go. The little caterpillar could see a patch of green far away. Was she brave enough to leave the crack to go that long way for food? It was so far away. What if there wasn't any grass and she had to go hungry? What if she got lost or eaten before she got there? The little caterpillar knew she couldn't stay in the hole forever because there wasn't any food. She was afraid to go out into that scary world again. Katie gathered her courage and left the safety of her hole. She crawled onto the hardwood cement. Each step made her body hurt and took all the strength she had, but she kept going. It took a long time for the little caterpillar to cross the cement. The sun was so hot and she was so tired. She was always on the lookout for dark shadows and was scared by every sound. Katie couldn't see the green leaves anymore. Were they still there? Was she going in the right direction? She was so hungry and tired and scared. She missed her family and her home. One step at a time, the little caterpillar kept going. It soon got dark and cold as big thunder clouds rolled in. The tiny hairs on the caterpillar's body, stood at attention, waiting for the command to fight if she was attacked. The clouds hid the sun, lightning shot across the sky, and thunder roared. Big drops of water splashed around the little caterpillar. They landed with loud smacks to the right, to the back, nearly on her head. The caterpillar couldn't think, she couldn't feel. She just moved forward with determination to get to the grass. Splat, plunk, kerplosh, splat. Just keep going, just keep going, just keep going.
Due to time constraints, I'm not going to show the rest of the video. It is available on YouTube if you'd like to go and finish watching. I wanted to make sure that I completed all the important stuff in my presentation that you wouldn't be able to find elsewhere. So I hope you enjoyed that little story. A friend of mine who teaches junior high classes has used this book the past 2 semesters and has found it really beneficial for her students in being able to talk about hard things and how do you overcome hard things. She has her students read the story and answer the following 4 questions. What did you learn from the caterpillar story? Did the caterpillar story help you? And what was your favorite part or your least favorite part of the story? There's a variety of ways you could use this depending on what you wanted your students to get out of it. There could be journaling. Students could work together in twos or in small groups to discuss specific questions such as how do you overcome challenges in your life, or what strengths did the caterpillar exhibit that helped her get through this challenge? How could you apply these strengths in your life? Like I said, there's also some discussion starter questions at the end of the book that you could use and put together in a lesson plan that addressed whatever you wanted to focus on in the story. We all love a good story, no matter how old we are. And these narratives can be a great way to teach an important lesson or skill without being obvious about it, because kids hate when we're obvious. But kids love to come up with answers on their own. And you might be surprised at what they come up with if given the chance. And I imagine a lot of your kids have had really hard things that they've had to overcome, and being able to share that. There's a benefit in being able to share it. There's a benefit in listening to other people and what they've been through, and providing some perspective of, oh, I'm not the only one that's gone through hard things, or, oh, maybe my hard things weren't as bad as their hard things. So there's a lot of benefit that youth can get out of a narrative. So resilience is an important skill to have. Adverse childhood experiences don't have to leave a significant lasting impact on our lives, which is the good news. Youth can learn resilience in school even if they aren't learning it at home. It can be implemented as part of the curriculum, which I think is great. A lot of schools are doing that. Studies show that it's not what happens to us, but our response to what happens to us that matters. One person may suffer what we might consider a small incident and be significantly traumatized, while another person may endure horrific abuse over a long period of time and not be detrimentally changed. So it's our perceptions that matter, as well as the number of resilience factors in our life. While in my practicum, I worked with a second grade Hispanic boy. I had the mom complete the ACEs and the resilience handouts, and their scores were 7 out of 10 ACEs and 13 out of 14 resilience factors. Now, 7 is a pretty high ACE score. 4 is considered significant. That's a lot of hard things that they had gone through as a family. But I was able to tell that mom when she asked, what does that mean? That I was able to say, your family has been through a lot of really hard things. And you have a lot of resources to manage it. And that's the good news. And that they were going to be okay. And I think that really helped her to really see that even though they had been through a lot of hard things, that they had a lot of resources to support them and to give them strength to be able to face those challenges and get through them okay. Studies have shown that if a child has at least one caring adult in their life, that it will make all the difference, or that it can make all the difference. I know that teachers can and often are that one caring adult. So don't underestimate the potential you have to change a life. And I hope you all know that. The good news is, after learning all the damage that trauma can do, even across generations, is that our brains can be restored, rebooted, and reset. We can heal a trauma brain, and that even teachers in their curriculum can implement different activities that will strengthen our brains. We live in a world that is constantly filled with noise, dings and rings and visual and auditory stimulation, even when we're asleep, if you keep your phones next to your bed. But a lot of the kids, that cell phone is attached to them 24/7 and it's on, and they don't realize that that's keeping them in that on mode all the time. And our brains need time to rest and recuperate, just like our bodies. Helping them understand that, taking a break from your technology is actually really good to help rest your brain. So taking even 5 to 10 minutes a day to stop and rest our brains can make a huge difference to our overall well-being. I was teaching social skills to a group of 12-year-old boys, and during one of the lessons, I had an activity where they were supposed to be still for 10 minutes. So, interestingly enough, they got comfortable on the floor. I do a lot of play therapy, so I had, stuffed animals and blankets, and they gathered these up and crawled under the little table I had, or in the corner with, their comfort objects, and then they were just quiet. It was a really interesting experience, because then afterwards we talked about, what that was like for them, and they loved it. And the next time they came for group, they're like, "Can we do that again?" And I think they kind of just needed a break. One, they were tired or overwhelmed or, whatever, and wanted to have a nap. But I think it was also just that it was just quiet. And their brains just got to have a break. And their bodies just got to rest and feel safe. And we need that. The kids need that every day, just even if it's just for a little bit. But this is a great way also to switch off that fight, flight, or freeze. So if you have kids that are, having struggles to focus, they're acting hypervigilant, being able to just take a few minutes to decompress and switch that off can help re-engage their learning brain. Maybe just have kids do it before a test or before recess or lunch, so it gives them that chance to decompress from everything that's gone on before and start fresh for the new activity. There are many ways to heal a trauma brain and even support an untraumatized brain. And a lot of these can be included in numerous different kinds of lesson plans and learning objectives. Here on this slide, I've given you just a few examples, as well as I've included a handout called Healing the Trauma Brain. And that gives a little more detail, different ways that you can include these activities along with things that you're doing. So Mindfulness can help increase our ability to focus. Maybe have them do the five senses exercise. So maybe you do it for a minute, and that helps train their brain to do those mindful activities and the focus activities. But have them for just a minute focus on 5 things that they can hear, 4 things that they can see, 3 things they can feel or touch, like the chair, the breeze, your clothes, 2 things that they can smell, and 1 thing that they can taste. But it's focusing on specific things. So maybe they hear the clock ticking, maybe they see the curtains, the blinds blowing if you have the window open or something, or they feel the air conditioner on their skin. So just different ways, but it's a practice in being able to focus and on specific items. And it's a skill that they can develop. They have to practice it. So it'll help them be able to then practice focusing on the teacher's voice or the test in front of them, that kind of thing. Though I have placed this topic last, taking care of teachers is an imperative to having healthy classrooms. If the teacher models healthy responses, shows how to handle stress in healthy ways, and isn't exhausted, they will be better able to help their students and teach effectively. That's a given, right? Thus, it's important to engage in your own personal care. I know that teachers are overloaded, especially during this COVID situation, and that's been a whole other experience. But remember that you can't give what you don't have. If your bucket has lots of holes and nothing's going in, but it's going in and right out, it's going to be hard to be an effective teacher and to manage all these traumatized children when they have their outbursts. If you're having a bad day, don't be afraid to let your kids know, because then that's modeling for them that not only are you human, but this is how humans can handle having a bad day. I'm having a bad day. I've got a headache today. I just want you to know it's not about you, or whatever. Just help them by showing them how to manage those kinds of situations. They may not have anyone modeling that for them at home, but you can model it for them in the classroom. And that's really important, to be able to help them see different ways to handle stressful situations or communication, those kinds of things. Find what brings you joy and be sure that you have some of that in your life every day. Take breaks, even during class time when needed. If you're feeling that things are getting out of control for you, maybe your emotions are getting out of control, and because of what's going on in the classroom, don't be afraid to just take a pause. Maybe that's a good time to engage your class in a be still activity or in a focus on the 5 senses activity. Take some deep breaths, walk away. These are things that we tell our students to do, but sometimes we don't do them ourselves. But, model that for your kids. It's okay to do that. Be sure you have sufficient resources of the right kind for you in and out of the classroom, in and out of school. If you feel you need professional support to learn new skills, manage stress levels, or deal with ongoing issues, support's available. Pay attention to what's going on for you in your life, and be sure that you're choosing to manage that in healthy ways as well. As I said, my mom was a first grade teacher for 18 years, and so I know that teachers have a lot that they're doing outside of class time. And I just want you to know how grateful I am for the hours and hours that you put in to help make a difference in the lives of your students. I know that teaching is often a thankless and often heartbreaking and exhausting job, and I could never do it. I am a much better one-on-one. Groups are exhausting for me, so I commend you for taking that task, because it isn't for everyone. But I know teachers do it because they love what they do and know that what you do matters. Even if you only make a difference in the life of one student, you don't know how much influence that student will have over time on so many others. Here are some good books to help in understanding trauma and how it impacts our bodies and our brains, our learning and our socializing. I also have a selection of books available at Amazon.com, which can be used for parenting in classrooms in a variety of ways. They all come with a discussion page at the end. And last, here is my contact page with information to my other resources, articles, books, videos, and more that can be used in the classroom. Like I said, I've got a YouTube channel with some videos, and I hope to put together activities that I do in my therapy that can be used in a classroom. So thank you for your time. I hope that this has been helpful and giving you some information that will be beneficial for you in your classroom and for yourself.